Hello and welcome to this second lesson on Late Night Women's Hour, our radio text for component 1. This lesson is specifically about context again, but also audiences, and it's the second of 3 lessons where by the third one we'll focus more on the application of the theoretical framework. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about a few different things regarding audience. We want to obviously know the appeals of different radio shows, and we're going to analyse the appeals of Late Night Women's Hour, looking at another case study, but also thinking about the one we considered for industry. And this will also take us on a bit of a journey whereby we look at the target audience as well. First of all, though, I do want to start with context, in particular social and cultural context, and then move on to historical context, because we have to take into account some of the unique elements of radio as a medium, as well as how it has evolved onto podcasting as well. And as we discussed previously, the introduction of Late Night Women's Hour into the Radio 4 schedule demonstrates the BBC's awareness of the need to cater for all areas of society. If you remember, that is an important and key part of their remit as their purpose as a public service broadcaster. So the topics discussed in the programmes reflect what is of interest and concern to young women in society today and cater for a specific social group who have been perhaps described as being previously underrepresented by the media, certainly perhaps by radio. So a couple of questions on reflection from what you know about Late Night Women's Hour and your experience of listening to the previous episode about Love Island. In what way would you say that the show is typical of a modern media product in the way that it represents social groups and the subject matters that it tackles? And a follow-up question for that would be, are there any other ways in which you would describe Late Night Women's Hour as typical of the era in which we live? Have a think about that, make some notes on your answer, and we'll be back with some ideas. So I'm sure you probably gave a number of different reasons why it's typical of modern media. I'm just going to focus on 2. First one would be to do with the fact that we do, it seems, live in increasingly politicised times, whereby it seems more and more people, regardless of their background, age, geographically, gender, whatever, everyone seems to have an opinion of pretty much everything. Perhaps it's the introduction of social media, perhaps it's the fact that we are more in tune with our own voices, we're made ever aware of our place in society, and what is referred to as identity politics, whether people see that as a good or a bad thing, it seems to dominate our political and ideological discourse. So it's perhaps not surprising to see a product like Late Night Women's Hour appear when we're talking more and more about different identities within society. The second element I wanted to pick out, and again something you may have made in your notes, was the fact that audiences are more media savvy than they ever have been before. And the reason is that they simply have to be. To make sense of the kind of myriad of signifiers in our popular culture, we're actually required to understand dozens of other pop culture references. So if you listen to a few episodes and if you look at the kind of content, if you listen to the conversations, you'll realise quite quickly that the show doesn't hide from this and actually often refers to media texts, often as points of reference for us to understand what's being talked about and discussed. So you may have had other answers to this question about how Late Night Women's Hour might be considered an example of modern media, but I've just picked 2. Its references to identity politics and also its references to other media products. Moving on to historical context, I want to focus more on the kind of recent technological advances and the fact that they have had an impact on radio as a medium in terms of how programmes are broadcast, how listeners receive those programmes. These technological developments have allowed radio to develop and increase in popularity, despite the fact that maybe critics have been heralding the end of the radio format for many years now. So although radio is what we might describe as a blind medium, many radio stations now have webcams in their studios, for example, allowing listeners to view presenters and guests on a radio show as they're listening, in an update to the medium. Radio programmes also often produce a podcast of the best bits which can be downloaded from a range of platforms, and this is something that Late Night Women's Hour does as well, and that's what I want us to focus our questions. Why would you say podcasts have become so popular over the past few years? What do they offer that a normal radio show cannot? And how are radio shows like Late Night Women's Hour embracing some of the unique aspects of podcasting? So again, let me give you some time to think about that, make some notes on all of these areas, be as comprehensive as you can, give as full an answer as you can to all of these questions. There's lots to say here. Well, as I said, plenty to think about there. I'm sure you've got plenty of notes on all of those things. Let's just think about a few of these different ideas, shall we? And that's the fact that podcasts really are something that can be for anyone at any time, anywhere, irrespective of what you're doing and who you're with or what your focus is. The technology, the ability to download means that you can listen to a podcast on the go. I found an assorted collection of images of here to represent the idea of anyone, anytime, anywhere. Podcasts allow the ability to be listening to when you're at a cafe, pretty rude, I suppose, whether you're out for a run, whether you are a hipster staring out of a window. They are for anybody, and that they are anywhere, anytime, and also that idea that they're for anyone, because podcasts have the ability to basically aim at maybe more niche audiences that radio, whether it's commercial or public service broadcasting, isn't necessarily able to do so because of the pressures of listening figures, the equivalent of viewing figures for a commercial radio station, the pressures of limited budgets perhaps for public service broadcasting. Radio has evolved into podcasts, and podcasts are incredibly cheap to make. So you can make them pretty much on any subject, trying to reach any niche audience, irrespective of nationality, ethnicity, age, religion, interests. There are podcasts out there for the most diverse and niche audiences going. And because they can be homemade, something that can be made with very simply, you don't even need a laptop. You could just use your mobile phone. You don't even need a brilliant microphone. You just need a mobile phone to make your own podcast these days. They are incredibly easy to manufacture and edit, and because you can make them from your own phone, your own back room, it means that you are not tied by the same sort of regulation as other radio stations are. You can make them as taboo as you want, tackling subjects that maybe commercial radio or PSB daren't go into. You aren't tied to the same sort of rules regarding what you can say on the radio. I mean, you're still limited in terms of defamation and breaking the law, but basically using whatever language you want to. Of course, the other aspect of podcasting is its connection with social media and the ability for it to be interactive. We've never had a time where audiences can feed back to the encoders of podcasts, of makers of the media, to give direct and immediate feedback on their content. Every podcast will usually have its relevant social media pages, whether that's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. You can communicate with, praise or criticise the makers of a podcast very, very easily, and give that feedback instantaneously. It's all tied together. It's that element of convergence that we've discussed about so many times. And I think you'll probably see that from having a look at some of the content of Late Night Women's Hour as well. If we just look at some of the titles of Late Night Women's Hour podcasts, I've just picked, I think, the 12 most recent, or 12 of the most recent titles, looking at things like makeup on public transport, looking at male and female friendships, looking at the subject of grief, looking at the subject of arguments, looking at the subjects of heart attacks, but also combined with taking your child to work, looking at shows like RuPaul's Drag Race and talking about feminism, looking at issues to do with body image, interviewing people like Kamala Harris, who is one of the Democratic presidential runners this year. Just a snapshot of the different topics covered by Late Night Women's Hour, and you get a real sense of the diverse nature of the topics. And this is very typical of podcasting, and this is a great example of what this show aims and achieves to do. So let's move on to think about who are the target audience that this show is trying to reach? Obviously, we're aware of who the target audience for Radio 4 is. Thank you to you for your amazing profiles on the target audience. But we need to decide a bit more about who the specific audience is for Late Night Women's Hour, because, of course, that will be slightly different or more specific to that audience rather than just the standard Radio 4 audience. Now, just to remind you, we have two approaches to defining audiences in media studies. The first, demographic. This is where we look at the factual information that we can assume about audiences. In other words, a profile who is the typical individual listener. This would include things like their age or an age bracket, their gender, their level of education, their political leanings, and other things that might be or may not be relevant, their nationality or ethnicity, perhaps their sexuality. If we give a decent enough profile of who's being targeted, we should also be able to work out the other media that they consume. This is what we call a demographic profile. The other aspect is a psychographic profile. This is where we consider who the audience is based on their psychological needs. Also, their ideologies on outlooks on life. Models such as Young and Rubicam's 4 Cs and also the vowel segmentation are useful here. So, what we're going to do, listen to the first half of another episode of Late Night Women's Hour. This episode is called Home. I'll explain a bit more about it in a second. But what I want you to do while you're listening is we want to make notes on how the content can give us an idea of who the target audience is, as well as making some initial notes on the appeals of the show. You can think about your experience of listening to the Love Island episode, as well as any other episodes you've listened to. This episode is hosted by Lauren Laverne rather than Emma Barnett. And this episode focuses on an aspect of home, specifically looking at this concept of hygge, which some of you may have heard of. It was something that was kind of, I suppose, on trend, a bit of the zeitgeist maybe a couple of years ago. And hygge is a Danish word which is used to acknowledge a special feeling or moment. It can be alone or with friends, at home or out. It can be ordinary or extraordinary, but it's always cosy, charming or special. It's this word that defines a kind of feeling of homeliness. And this is a big part of the conversation they have. So listen to this first half of the episode, make a note of who's being interviewed and where their background is from. Make a note again of the conversations that are going on and how Laverne moves the topics. Think about the tone and the feel of the show, how it creates that feeling of a natural conversation flowing from one person to the next, almost like people out for lunch having a chat, old friends as it were. Okay, so think about all those aspects that we considered when we looked at the previous episode, but this time I want you to think more specifically, who are our target audience? Okay, here we go. This is the first half of Home.
This month on Late Night Women's Hour, winter is coming. Without wishing to get too Game of Thrones about it, the nights are drawing in and so are more of us. Our subject this month is home. Are you creating a nest to hibernate for the winter? What does home mean to you? And why has the Scandinavian art of hygge become the word of the season? Genius marketing or emotional need? Joining me tonight, podcaster and crafter Helen Zaltzman. Hello, Helen.
Hello.
Rachel Hurdley, Research Fellow in the School of Social Science at Cardiff University. Welcome.
Hello.
Susie Orbach, psychotherapist and author. Hello to you.
Hello.
And Trina Harneman, chef and author. Welcome, Trina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me all. So, hygge is the latest confusingly spelled domestic trend to hit the UK, imported from Scandinavia. You've probably seen it written down, and it's spelled Hygge. Should you wish to read about it further, you currently have over 100 volumes to choose from on one popular book website. There's hygge home decor, hygge food, hygge parenting, even a hygge colouring book, which I presume you have to do by a fire wearing a pair of cosy socks. Trina, tell me about this word, hygge. We keep being told that it's untranslatable. Can you have a go for us as a Dane?
The hygge? I think it's true in a way, because when you have a word that is so absorbed in your culture and your daily life, it's kind of odd to have to translate it all of a sudden to the whole world. So I think that's where the Danes are right now. We're a bit in shock. What is this about? Why? What's going on?
Everybody's asking.
Yes. And it's a word we use all the time,
okay.
Every day, for a lot of situations. It is a bit more than coziness because it is such a part of the way we live.
So it's fundamental to Danish culture and it is in all of the aspects. Can you give me some examples? Like what can be hygge? Obviously, we know that kind of food and an atmosphere and in a place can be hygge. What about people? Can they be hygge?
Yeah, if they're in a certain mood, they
Okay.
can, but they can also not be. But hygge is about setting the stage of how things should be.
Okay.
It's a social norm. It's a convention. So therefore, it's more than coziness. So it also has some negative sides to it. It's not only getting together, and hygge is all year round. It's not only in the winter, but of course, when it's translated, it seemed like to be the thing with the candle and the food and the hot chocolate and all these, lovely things that we all want in our lives. But it is a way of setting the tone of being together, of hanging out. And Danes are very much into have some pleasant kind of togetherness, if you could say, every day.
But can I ask, if you say you use the word several times a day, would you apply it to a sensibility, a person, beyond an atmosphere? How do you get to say it 5 times a day?
Because you say it like, you say, that was very hyggelig. Mm-hmm. And that was a hyggelig time. He was a hyggelig person. You could say that, but you wouldn't say that as much.
Okay, that would be more unusual.
No, not really. But to be a hyggelig person is something. That's a hyggelig person. That's something. He's like, if I think about a hyggelig man, he would be kind of a little bit big. He would feel safe. He would feel somebody you'd trust. It's like.
It's so interesting. Trina, your book is about hygge, but it's mainly a cookbook. And
Yes.
it's about comfort eating and Danish comfort food. To what extent is food a part of hygge?
Danes never get together without, eating and drinking something. Coffee is our main thing, but of course alcohol comes into it at some point. When you meet a Dane, that will not ask you how you are. We don't. When we start to travel the world, we are always very confused when people ask you how you are because we will actually answer, and that's the wrong thing to do. So what we would say is, "Hi, please come in. Would you like a cup of coffee?" Our first greeting will be to invite you to enjoy something with us.
Okay, so there's a very big social element to all
Yes.
this then. That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it is also about leveling us out. It has a very egalitarian thing to it.
Okay.
Danes is not very big on hierarchy. We're very big of making sure we're all at the same, level. We don't really like people to stick out. So therefore, hygge is also like the social norm that set the stage for now we're all sitting here being equal, having a great time.
It's like a socialist coziness.
There were a lot of jumpers. There are a lot of jumpers in that particular political nook, as far as I'm aware, Helen.
No wonder
Is
it's popular.
it?
Now,
Is it actually inclusive? Because the sense I get is that it can be a bit exclusionary. You're with old friends or you're with family, because the whole idea is that being comfortable, being familiar. Would you invite a stranger in? Could you, as a stranger, kind of feel hyggelig?
Yeah, I think you could. That's a very interesting question in the sense that Danes are not very good at inviting strangers in. It takes a long time to get really close, I think, to Danes. But if you do, it's for life.
Once you're in, you're in. So, Rachel, you're asking there about something that you've written about, I think, is the Scandinavian dream.
What I have written about is, I suppose, the ubiquitousness of IKEA in people's homes, and how somehow IKEA and Scandinavian, and then that's kind of extended vaguely into ideas of Danishness and now hygge. How British culture, it sort of started off quite simply with a couple of tea lights on the mantelpiece, and now it seems to be kind of expanding into this vague. All we know about Scandinavia is that it's kind of a bit north of Germany and it's not France. And we're kind of going into Tiger now, the Danish, well, we call it the Danish pound shop, but it's far more than a Danish pound shop. And the way in which British culture we're kind of going out and getting all these bits and bobs of the Scandinavian
So the
dream.
accoutrement of this kind of imagined lifestyle. What is the appeal, do you think? Susie Orbach, I mean, the lure of the domestic here is very strong, obviously. What are we looking for? What are we searching for?
In a way, we're in a period that's a bit like the 50s. It's a kind of retrenchment of the home or the domestic and of femininity in a particular form at a moment when we've actually got a world crisis going on, and which we're encouraged to see the outside as incredibly dangerous and rather insecure. And so we've got both the democratization of we can all have the glamorous house, we can create an internal house that looks like it's for display, that we then move into so we feel like a proper person and we feel like a sophisticated in this world that's so damn confusing.
Okay, so it kind of exists in opposition to a wider context of...
Which we're both part of, but we're also individualising, except we're actually, with the mass marketing of design, which is no bad thing, but we're all at the same time curating ourselves in the same way, if you like.
So curating ourselves.
Yes,
this is the key word, isn't it? And it's digital culture is a big part of this, because I wanted to do this programme initially. I had a conversation with a writer recently, and he was talking about hygge and the trends, the trend for hygge kind of coming to the UK, and he sees it as a reaction to digital culture. And
but it isn't, isn't it? Because at the same time, when you're preparing your food, you take a snapshot. I don't think it's called a snapshot anymore, but you take a photo, you might not put it on Instagram, but you might say to your friend, look how gorgeous. So that even you yourself are engaging in the act of showing and of displaying, and displaying actually to yourself as much as to anyone else. So that is digital. So it's both playing with digital culture and trying to manage something that's particularly personal, intimate.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It's almost a Zen meditation as well. Like if you craft something or make something without Instagramming it, does it exist? It's the kind of new tree falling in the woods.
Helen unexamined life is not worth living, but it's a public examination.
Helen Saltzman, you are a crafter. What do you craft?
Things that I don't know how to make, I suppose. I think that's what's interesting to me. At the moment, my time's very limited for doing anything fun, which is annoying. So usually I craft things if someone needs an unusual item they can't buy.
Such as, come on.
My brother needed some dolls of the cricketers W.G. Grace and Frank Spofford. And you can't buy those in the toy shops, it seems.
Inexplicably.
I know.
Hard to find.
And also, there's not really a pattern for either of those cricketers online.
Those particular cricketing dolls are, yeah.
No, so I thought, well, only one way to figure this out is to
What
jump right in there.
materials did you use?
Well, I used an old sheet for the cricket whites. I made a nice moss stitch beard for WG. They had felt faces. I think the hats were probably felt as well. One of them was known for being very smart. Fred Spofford. I learnt a lot as well whilst making him. He was a very dapper Australian cricketer, and so he always used to wear a tie. So he had a nice ribbon tie in the appropriate colours.
This seems to me to be very much in counterpoint to your professional life, which is, as you know, a podcaster. You're there editing, you're writing, working, using screens a lot, I would imagine. So does it feel like a contrast when you're crafting?
The fundamental thing that I enjoy about it is the same, which is at the end there is something that didn't exist at the beginning. But yes, the acts of it are quite different. I like the fact that there's this physical engagement when I'm crafting with materials. But in both cases, I taught myself how to do things I didn't know how to do them. And there are these engineering problems in different forms in the podcasting and in the crafting. But it's a shame that the podcasting has ruined my crafting time. I think because who knows what dead men I could be making effigies of now if I...
But is it required that it be soft materials? I mean, Is that the definition of craft, or could it involve
interesting.
metal or
Yes.
wood?
Yes,
Or-
I absolutely
yes,
think so.
you could have a bit of an old car as part of your crafting.
Wood can definitely be, for
Yes,
sure.
I know wood
Yeah.
can, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to think
Yes.
about what materials you might exclude.
Where
I
are
don't
the
know
limits?
What this has got to do
Well,
with hygge, but
Does
anyway,
it involve tools? Is it to do with the tools?
you mean apart from our hands?
I think
Apart
it's
from, soldering irons, for
yeah,
example.
I think it's small scale manufacture. In
Yeah.
answer to your question about materials, I'm wearing some earrings that I bought off Etsy, which is the website where handicrafters
Yeah.
effectively sell their stuff, and they're made out of concrete.
Right.
So
They
I
are
think
fabulous.
concrete can count as craft, right?
For sure,
I
yeah.
haven't experimented with it yet.
So, Helen, I mean, this is all about creating something that is unique, it's individual, it's handmade, it's homemade, and presumably there is a kind of connection between craft and hygge. I mean, can you see the appeal, Helen?
There's certainly a personalisation inherent in it. If you're talking about people's homes being so much more populated by IKEA products, then the crafted objects are the antithesis of that in a way. They're these unique objects. And that imprint of individuality. If someone has an object that is a one-off, even if I'd made 100 WG Greystools, they'd all probably vary a little from each other.
Trina, the Danish sort of perspective on hygge that you've brought us so far seems to be very kind of social. As you say, it's egalitarian, it's inclusive. Is this idea of kind of handmade, homemade skill central to it as well?
Both yes and no. I don't think necessarily. It's more about actually creating that atmosphere. Yeah, but it could be in the sense that I think hygge leads to some kind of authenticity. That is also what people are seeking out, and I think that's one of the real reason why it's on the agenda now. Is the Danes being the happiest people on the planet, the Scandinavian welfare model everybody's looking at right now. I mean, the whole idea that we actually think that the world is on fire more or less out there, and there's so many things going on we don't understand, and people feel more anxious, and they're looking at other countries and see how are they figuring it out. And you can say about the Scandinavian countries, we have actually figured some things out, especially when it comes to equality, better balance between home and work, and things like that. And I think the hygge ties into that.
Susie?
I suppose the thing that always impresses me from the outside is the fact that you've got a social contract that's about contribution and about engagement. What I wanted to know is, as a cook, is there competition in the cooking, or is it just relished and enjoyed, the individuality of your food prep?
Home cooking is a big thing still. Everyday home cooking. I'm not only talking about, people going out on Saturday and shop for 4 hours and cook for 6 hours. I'm talking about the daily meal.
And Trina, you advocate kind of cooking communally together, right?
Yes.
You're a big advocate of that.
Yeah.
Why?
Because I believe it brings you together. It starts a conversation about all the important things in life. And even if you can't speak the same language, you can always cook together.
And this collective element that you're describing, do you think that's missing from the kind of lifestyle press version of hygge that we're getting over here? Rachel, you kind of think we're missing some elements of it.
I guess what I'm concerned about, in a way, is, books have been written about how IKEA has become emblematic of the modern, and it's that very conscious branding and appropriating of artefacts without any of the history, the cultural value, any idea of the symbolic meaning behind it, that people go out and get the books and kind of maybe talk about them. I actually saw there are some slippers being advertised as Hygge for 60 quid, which is the antithesis
Trina,
of what
be
you're
honest,
talking
how much
about.
did your slippers cost?
I still wear the socks that my grandmother knitted for me.
Now that's serious hygge,
Yes, that's
right?
serious hygge.
That's doing
Yeah.
it right. Okay, the
I-
£60 slipper's not so much for you.
IKEA store is really weird. I just want to say that that's the only place where I never ever go with my husband, because we would have a divorce. I mean, I have a very, very paradoxically kind of relationship with IKEA because I was brought up with it, and I don't get the whole idea of it. Sorry.
Is it all the
whole world.
capitals? It can feel quite shouty to me. Or everything's in capitals. It's like, whoa, okay, settle down.
I do have to say that I knew that my first marriage had come to an end when we were ordering a wardrobe in Bristol IKEA.
I
It's a
think
great
the
book title.
Rachel, it is. It also feels like the beginning of a film.
Yeah. Okay, maybe not Disney, but
But definitely with a happy ending at the end. I mean, Rachel, let's talk a bit then about the meaning of home, because it's obviously culturally and historically specific. We often describe home as a sanctuary, but apparently that's a relatively modern idea. When does that kind of idea come in?
the conscious creation of home as sanctuary came about towards the end of the 18th century. Really, it's tied up with industrialisation, profit, Protestant spirit of capitalism.
Enterprise.
That somehow there had to be an other to that. And that was consciously created, the angel of the hearth, by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men with, the woman at home, and her duty was to look after her family and to exhibit virtue, purity, piety and domesticity.
Not doing very well on any of those. I'm just that checklist. Fail. So before that, you're saying that there wasn't this kind of separation between the private sphere and the public sphere in the same way, this kind of gendered separation.
The change wasn't sudden, and obviously industrialisation happened at different times in different places. But if you think about the early modern era, the workshop could be in the back of the house, it could be in the cellar, you might have the loft above, for the silk
1700s,
weaving.
1800s?
Yeah, and then what happened was as, manufacturing stopped being craft, really, and became industry, you start to have this split. And whereas previously everything had been tangled together, and as a woman you were in charge of the house and household management, but that was actually quite a complex business, that gradually, there's this move out to the suburbs, and your man has kind of fled to the city to have this quite masculine existence, and then comes home at night to the little woman who's made this sanctuary of religious, virtuous, domestic perfection.
So that's a kind of archetype from a kind of 20th century archetype. Where are we at now, and how are things changing?
It's interesting to get back to what Susie was talking about, that what happened with the First and in particular the Second World Wars was women were going out to work also for a number of reasons, none of which are absolutely certain. Family size had shrunk, so people were just having two. It was respectable to have two children rather than sort of acres of them spreading up into the attics and down to the cellars. And then after the Second World War, particularly in North America and in Britain, this idea of having the wife at home looking after her man became all entangled with patriotism. And so these women suddenly found themselves back at home in the suburbs, probably necking Valium when that came along.
You could smell it off them.
Yes.
Not
Susie?
quite.
Really?
You could smell the farmer on the women.
So, Susie, you're talking about what I think Betty Friedan referred to as the problem with no name, which is the phrase from the
Which
feminine
was
mystique.
competing at the same time with keeping up with the Joneses in Britain. So you've got attempts to make the home, this sanctuary, be something that's as competitive as the marketplace. And
So it's a kind of parallel.
so that women themselves became involved in a game of competition. It's really quite interesting.
A kind of game of yes, they moved in tandem, didn't they? The
Yeah.
production in the workplace and what we're seeing, the new consumerism.
Right. So once you're out of
housewife.
once you're out of the munitions factories, give us back our wives and sweethearts, you then have to recognise that they actually are used to the sophisticated competition or the camaraderie. So you have a virtual camaraderie, don't you? You don't actually have a hygge camaraderie. I mean, maybe you give them a radio or a television serial to watch, but and maybe you have this insulting thing called a coffee clutch, which was
What's a coffee clutch?
That was
That's
when
the-
women got together because they were sort of a bit lonely and they needed to discuss their recipes
Oh,
and
okay,
their
so
children and their
coffee
sewing.
morning, yeah.
Everything that we now actually think, oh, that's really interesting. That was women's culture and how fabulous and extraordinary. But there's all these different strains going on, I think.
Trina, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think when you talk about consumerism, the hygge thing is quite important, because that is kind of the opposite. Whereas of course, it's played on for everybody who wants to sell anything. I know that. But if you talk about something being hyggelig, you'd have a good example of saying that, we can't afford to do this and that, but instead we'll go home and have a hyggelig time together. You use it a lot like that. So even up through the 60s and 70s, and so it became something that would be, we might not be able to afford this, but that's okay because we are so good at having a hyggelig time instead.
You don't need to spend the money.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's just the first half of the episode of Home. Really interesting episode, quite in-depth look at something that I suppose we take for granted every day. But what I want to know is, who are the target audience? So two different ways of outlining the target audience, demographic and psychographic. Give as much detail as possible. I do realise this means that you probably have to go back on some notes of your old notes on audience to look at what those 4 C's categorizations are, and also the vowel segmentation you might need to look up as well. Okay, but it won't take long either to go back into your notes or a quick Google search to find out more. Think of who's being targeted here. It doesn't obviously have to just be a reflection of who's being interviewed or what they're talking about, but think about those issues and see if you can come up with some specifics, even if you realise there are multiple audiences. Okay, take some time to do that. So, once we've looked a little bit more at classification, we can consider this in terms of what the BBC are looking at and who they're specifically targeting. If we look at the review that the BBC has every few years, we can look at some of their strategic objectives. And here are the bullet points of what they were specifically trying to do at their last review point. They wanted to transform their offer, in other words, the content that they provide, for younger audiences. Transforming mainstream services to better appeal to younger audiences. They wanted to further develop existing services for younger audiences. And they wanted to be more innovating online to respond to the changing media world. So my first question is, what evidence is there from your experience of listening to 1.5 episodes now, what evidence would you say there is to suggest that Late Night Women's Hour is part of those changes from the last annual review? The review also states, Radio 4 delivers the BBC's public purposes to nearly 11 million listeners who tune in on average for over 11 hours each week. Our review found that Radio 4 sets the standard for high-quality, intelligent speech radio programming. It is highly thought of by its audience, many of whom regard it as a national institution. So if we think about what else we know about Radio 4's audience in terms of age, gender, social class and education, what I want to do is I want you to think about 2 questions. First of all, what evidence is there that Late Night Women's Hour is actually trying to challenge the established Radio 4 audience? Okay, in what ways do you feel it's trying to be something a bit different from that bog standard Radio 4 audience? Give your evidence for that. But then conversely, I want you to think about what evidence is there to suggest that actually Late Night Women's Hour will still reach the traditional Radio 4 audience. So what does it have to offer for that old existing audience? 2 questions, 2 opposite bits of evidence. Can you find it from what you know about the show so far? Off you go. Okay, so let's move on a bit more specifically to audience appeals. And first of all, an article from the Daily Mail Online and its review of the show when it first began broadcasting back in 2015. So I want you to just have a look through the article. It's there below. according to that article, what would you say are the appeals of the show? So just make some notes after reading the article. Well, if you do have a look at that article, hopefully some of the things that you'll have found, if you sort of dissect and summarise the main arguments made. First one, Lauren Laverne. As a host and as a celebrity presence, as a personality, perhaps, shall we say. Second one is the language and the mode of address is talked about in the article. They also mention the themes of the programme or podcast. And they also talk about how the audience is constructed through the style of the programmes as well as the choice of guests. And they do reference the fact that the guests tend to be fairly well educated people and often, although this isn't always the case, but often highbrow. And they talk about the fact that, of course, the show is available across a range of different platforms, and, of course, it's available, therefore, to a global audience. Before we move on, this would be an interesting time to talk about regulation as well, because one of the things mentioned in the article is how it's maybe slightly irreverent, how they do draw attention to the fact that the F word was used in an episode of Late Night Women's Hour, even though that was apologised for. And we have to talk about this in terms of implications of radio and regulator. Now, you may or may not be aware that a regulator for radio is Ofcom, the Office of Communications, same as television. And the fact, the article from the Mail actually alludes to the fact that shows cannot just simply broadcast whatever they want because they're regulated by Ofcom. Now, Ofcom is a body that is accountable to Parliament, the government, in other words. Ofcom is involved in advising and setting some of the more technical aspects of regulation, which will implement and also enforce the law. When it comes to broadcasting, the role of Ofcom is to ensure a wide range of TV and radio services of high quality and wide appeal is available, fulfilling the public service broadcasting remit, in other words. They are there to maintain plurality and in the provision of broadcasting so that everyone has their say and that this isn't dominated by just a select few people. They are there to adequately protect audiences against offensive or harmful material, much in the same way that the BBFC is there to protect cinema audiences from harmful material. And Ofcom's other role is to protect audiences against unfairness or infringements of privacy when it comes to journalism. The BBC, of course, is also self-regulatory, so that actually what the BBC does is it works towards ensuring that there's no need for Ofcom. If anything, nothing really should slip through the net of any BBC TV show or radio show, so that Ofcom should receive any complaints or have to act at all. Audiences can complain to Ofcom, of course, though. They can complain regarding a particular programme that could be considered harmful or offensive. Ofcom will then assess the complaint under the terms of the Broadcasting Code before they decide what action to take. And regulation will be discussed in a little more detail when we look at the application of theory in the next session. So let's stick with appeals and think about the appeals specific to radio, because in an age dominated by visual images, it's important to remember why radio has had such a long and enduring appeal. Of course, it lasts longer than TV. It was an invention that came before television. In particular, we'll have a look at the appeals that are unique to a medium that really you can only listen to. And these are set out and described in 4 different ways. First of all, radio is what's known as the blind medium. It only involves the sense of hearing with no visual images. In this sense, the medium can be seen to have advantages in that it allows the audience to actually use their imaginations. They fill in the blanks themselves when it comes to images. It's also known as the companion medium. A radio format provides a strong sense of personal communication for the audience. It can provide interactive opportunities for audiences to think about their own experiences. And when you're looking at radio in that sense, it also becomes quite intimate. Radio is very personal. It encourages intimacy by a direct mode of address. Sometimes you can feel like the radio is talking directly to you, or that you maybe are the only audience member out there, particularly if you're listening through headphones. And of course, it's also, I suppose this is slightly in contrast to the last two, but it's also very undemanding. Actually, as opposed to TV, the radio can allow you to do other things whilst listening and still maintain that connection. So, I'm going to ask you to listen to the remainder of the second text that we're studying for this scheme of work, the second half of the episode Home. What I want you to make notes on is the appeals that we've just mentioned. In what ways would you say we can apply these ideas of radio being the blind medium, the companion medium, the intimate medium and the undemanding medium? Think about specific parts of this second episode of Home. And as we move through, I'm also going to throw up on the screen the other uses and gratifications model, the ways in which you can consider other appeals. So use Home as an example, but also the late night women's hour episode we listened to in the first lesson, the episode on Love Island. You can consider that too. So we've got a decent list of appeals with evidence as well. Just a quick reminder before I press play on the second half of the guests on this particular episode. Clockwise from top left, you've got the podcaster, writer and crafter Helen Zaltzman. You've also got sociologist Dr. Rachel Hurdley. The bottom right, you've got the Danish food writer and chef Trina Hanneman. And then on the bottom left there, you've got the psychologist and writer Susie Orbach. So, as I said, make some notes on the different appeals of Late Night Woman's Hour based on the things on the top in the blue box there, and also the uses and gratifications model, which I'll put up as you're listening.
Susie, I mean, a home is an emotional space as well as a physical one, isn't it? How central is it to our emotional health?
For some of us, it's absolutely critical. But there are people for whom home is actually quite frightening. And they don't want to be there, and they don't know what to do with themselves when they are there, or they want to get away from the children, or historically men haven't known what their place is. So I don't actually think we can say what is home. We could probably go around this table and say what's home for each of us, but it's sold to us as the place of privacy and of truth, authenticity, as you were saying, and of self-expression. But honestly, it's also a place of drudgery and difficulty, hard work, and for me, enormous pleasures. I work from home, and I also love my home.
Let me bring in Helen Zaltzman here because, I know that you are currently between abodes.
Yes.
Should we say?
Yes,
Helen, how should we phrase it? You had to pack everything up and stay with your brother for a bit.
Yeah, my our landlord wanted to move back into his flat, fine, because it's his flat. And we'd been living there for 10 years, so it felt very much like our home. So at the moment, we're living in my brother's attic, which is very homely, but it's not my home. And nearly all of my stuff is in a storage unit in South London. Is that my home? Probably not. And weirdly, I wasn't very pleased when he announced that he was returning after 10 years of us living there. But now that it's happened, the lack of attachment, I feel I'm actually fine with. In a way, I feel like the home that I now seek isn't necessarily a permanent residence, or at least for the next couple of years. It might be moving around and interacting with various different people, and I get that sense from their proximity rather than the physical space.
So what are the objects that you've kind of carried with you that constitute home? What makes home for you?
Oh, that's a very good question. I have a large collection of square scarves, so I brought a good few dozen of those. But, that's the capsule collection, right? And my husband brought some of his guitars. Again, his capsule collection of guitars is still a lot of guitars by most people's standards of guitars. But I think if there were no instruments at all, then it would feel like we were staying in a Travelodge or something. But I've only got 20 books, and that I know. Ugh.
And what about the stuff that's in storage? Are you missing it? Because this is the thing, when you move, I think, and most of us have probably had an experience where we've moved house and maybe you haven't unpacked for a bit or something, but those boxes of stuff that you spend ages packing up and you think it's indispensable, and then you just forget what's in it, don't you? Is
now
that
I'm
just
thinking,
me?
what is the point of all that stuff? Except the other day it was getting cold, because also the heating doesn't work in the house that now I live in, and I was thinking, my favourite winter mug's in storage, and I don't even know whether I'll see it for a year or where I'll be unpacking it. And that felt a bit weird. And that's just that's a £2 mug. It's not even a good mug. It's just my favourite winter mug.
I think you'll understand that, Trina, because I've read your book and I know that you're quite particular about your mugs.
Yes. That's like I have a morning one, I have an afternoon, I have one for coffee, one for tea.
Okay, and they've got to be the perfect one for the perfect time.
Yes.
This sense of ritual then about eating and drinking for you, is that the kind of ritual element of dining important?
Yes, it is. But I'm very fond of my home, but I'm not attached to it like we're talking about.
Okay.
And I think it has to do with my childhood, that I was, I lived in a lot of communes with my very left-wing parents who was trying to do things in a different ways. So I can live anywhere. I can live in a suitcase. I travel a lot. I don't mind it, but I need to have a cup of tea in the morning, even though I'm not British, I'm Danish. So, if I go to a hotel, I will find my favorite cup right away. And I'll ask for it if it's not there the next day, or if I rent. So I have these things where I try to kind of recreate what I think is important.
I suppose it comes back to meaning. I've just moved home, so I've got the boxes. I'm not in a position to unpack them yet because, a couple of thousand of them are books. A couple of thousand of volumes of books, right?
Okay, not a couple of thousand boxes.
No, and kitchen.
Susie, this is out of control. This hoarding's got to stop.
The two things that matter to me, the kitchen and books. Apart from people, which are very important. But what interested me in this transition was that despite the fact that I was moving to somewhere that was very much appealed to me architecturally and design-wise, I really felt so attached to the place that I was living in that I thought I would mourn it. And the minute that I got into this new place, I thought, I don't even want to go back there. I have no feeling for it. It's kind of over for me. And that was a big shock. I don't know if it relates to your story.
Exactly the same. Yeah.
I was really surprised because I thought I am a homebody. I go out in my forest, but I see people at home, and I write from home, so I see patients, and I'm at home a lot. And I thought that it was my physical environment was so important to me. Yet I found myself being able to just kiss it goodbye.
So home is its spirit as well as a physical place.
It's internalised in some way, I think. Maybe it's because I'm so ancient at this point that whatever home means, it is part of me, and it has come with me to be expressed in a new form. But I had a surprise.
But maybe it's also because we're lucky it wasn't a traumatic removal from home.
Correct.
That we had
exactly so.
So let's talk about the idea of kind of opening up your life at home to the wider world. Trina, you've done that with your book. Did you worry at all about the way it would be received and people perhaps disagreeing or judging, especially if you're saying, this is what hygge means to me, and it's something that's such a big part of Danish culture?
Nope, not at all. Because that's my way of living, and I'm not being judgmental of other people. But of course, I come from a culture where a dining table is really, really important. We don't have homes really without a dining table, and the whole idea of having people over for dinner, both casually and spontaneously, and is such a big part of how we do it. And I think it's a great story. And I really, really, truly believe that in that sense, the Scandinavians have something to offer to the world and say, you don't have to work 50, 60 hours a week. It's pretty important to pick up your children around 4 or 5 o'clock and go home and have dinner with them and speak to them. And I don't really care what you cook. It doesn't have to be, 2 hours organic meal forever and ever. You can also just buy, just cook it and sit down and eat and enjoy yourself or your friends or, and I believe actually, really naively, that if we did that a lot and sat down, we could change the world.
But do you think it's... I suppose the Scandinavian bit is finishing work early, because what you're describing is incredibly Jewish, it's incredibly Middle Eastern, it's incredibly Indian. I grew up in a household where anybody who walked through the door was fed, whether they actually wanted to be or not, because that's what you did. And I was in shock when I went to other people's houses and was asked to wait in the sitting room while they finished their dinner. I was...
Oh, my God.
I just didn't understand it. It wasn't what I came from.
Sure.
So what I think is very different about what you're talking about is that positioned in the Western world, where working from 6 a.m. to God knows what time is now privileged as being the way to be. Your bit of the continent has challenged that.
And I think we can put food back into that discussion and time to hygge. And I think the most important thing that we bring to the table right now is that it's socially acceptable for both men and women to get up at their work around 4 o'clock and say, I have to pick up the kids and go home and cook.
Permission to slow down and permission to opt out of the kind of busy commercial, to work, really. Work.
So that's kind of like the Italian Citas, the slow food movement.
Rachel.
And also this egalitarianism in parenting, because I know, for example, my husband and I shared parental leave when we adopted our daughter when she was 9 months old. So he took the first half, I took the second half. And his time off was greeted with astonishment. We work in a school of social sciences, and even, the social scientists were going, oh my God, what are you doing? Because it's that idea of career and
my
getting
partner
on.
at the time was asked, are you sure it's your baby?
What?
Even though, because he was the first person to take parental leave.
Trina, they're talking about the work-life balance and the split between work and home.
It's just fantastic.
To what extent do we think that work is encroaching on home now? Because this is another problem of, digital culture and the mobile, because work is always there. Email is always there. You're always contactable. Rachel, what do you think about that?
It's problematic because, there's this concept in geography, of the third space, which always used to be, somewhere like the coffee shop or these liminal spaces, which aren't quite one thing or the other. But what's happening is that people are working from home all the time. I can check my emails in the middle of the night with this mobile working environment. I actually researched the opposite, which I've called homing from work, because with this sort of blurring of boundaries,
checking Facebook while you should be doing something.
Well, my dear, I didn't speak to anyone who did that. but I have my slippers at work because it seems utterly peculiar. I'm spending a lot of time in this place. Of course, I'm going to put my slippers on. But the way in which people can do that with something as small as a mug. Even in a hot desking environment, you've got your mug, you've got your cardie on the back of the chair, and that place is yours for a time.
So does your research show that we're doing that more, that we're personalising work more and blurring the boundaries between the two places?
If people can. For some people that is very difficult, because what's happened with this, this idea of mobile working, I can go and set up in any of the branded coffee shops or on that sofa over there, is that people are losing space. I know in the BBC, there was a lot of difficulty when everything suddenly went open plan and, programmes started losing their studios where they'd hunkered down and hung their Mexican hats on the clock and so on, as I've noticed you've done in Woman's Hour.
Woman's Hour, that is the hat of joy. Occasionally people have to pop it on when they need to perk up.
The hat of joy.
That's the secret.
It's that maybe what we're getting back to is, just what people have been talking about home not being a place somewhere to be mourned as we move on to the next, or chucked out of our place. But it's more to do with, I think this is hygge actually, the here and now, mindfulness. I know, for example, work I did with refugees, asylum seekers who are destitute, is that they felt at home for the 2 hours in a drop-in centre when they were just talking over a cup of tea, perhaps preparing food together. That was a kind of forced placelessness. But actually, maybe that's what it would be a good idea to get back to, rather than this obsession with territorial ownership of space.
Susie, is togetherness a good enough word?
Yeah, but togetherness is also part of it. But you can hygge alone as well.
You can hygge alone. So does that mean that because you feel bountiful inside and you feel content enough and warm enough. And
I think in the British depictions that I've seen in magazines and stuff of hygge, it is a very solitary activity as far as it's being portrayed to us. It's generally speaking a lady in cosy socks holding a coffee with two hands, holding a coffee like it's a bowl of cereal in a way that I don't think anyone ever actually drinks coffee that way, but that seems to
burn
be.
their hands.
Yes.
Does it require a slanket? then?
Yeah, or a Christmas jumper, but at any time of year.
Yeah.
I'm up for both those things, I've got to be
No
honest.
harm in it.
Hygge is kind of part of this new domesticity. Susie, what do you make of that? I think of it as kind of keep calm and have a cupcake culture.
you don't think it was the selling of women back, some aspect of femininity back to women in a slightly more, post-Superwoman, which we never actually got beyond, which was the Thatcher rip-off of second-wave feminism, where we had to have it all and be it all and do it all at the same time. Was there something about that domesticity, and maybe Nigella, unwittingly or wittingly, was part of this, was we will make it ours in a different way. We'll make it rounded. We won't make it with hard joints. We will make it bountiful and sharing. And part of that story, of course, was this is damn frightening, those women out there in the world. We're going to tell them their place, and then, we're going to tell them what their bodies have to look like, and then we're going to tell them exactly how they have to perform femininity. And then you get Nigella, who's both subversive and non-subversive, because she says, no, you're not going to do it that way. We're going to actually have that delicious stuff that you're telling us we're not allowed to have. We're going to lick it. We're going to wear it. We're going to be sensual, and we're going to be as big as we are or as small as we are. It's irrelevant. We are going to take up the space. So I think there was something kind of transgressive about the counterpoint to the domestic that was the domestic goddess.
Maybe to my shame, I have never seen a Nigella telly programme or the Great British Bake Off or any of that stuff.
I've never seen the Bake Off, which is really shameful because I just watched it waiting downstairs here.
Was it good?
It's completely riveting because it's craft.
Aha.
It's about the capacity of the ordinary and the pleasure in the ordinary. I mean, as somebody who does cook, but I can't bake, I'm really fascinated by another cookery skill and the interest and engagement with that. And this seems to me to be so touching and so engaging because you're really interested in how they're doing it, how they're actually solving the problems that they're encountering as they're preparing the dough.
It is called the cult of domesticity.
Correct.
Cult was actually shortened originally, historically, from culture. It is a cult. It's all on Pinterest, it's on Instagram. And I'm just wondering, as endearing as the Great British Bake Off might be, for example, is it just another way of branding, of putting in inverted commas everyday life, what people have just been doing and are doing, and then someone goes, oh, hang on a minute, let's get some books and TV programmes out of this.
Maybe it is, but maybe for the few minutes that I saw, what really interested me is that it's reflective of something about cultural change, which is it wasn't white, it wasn't female, it wasn't young.
So this is the Bake Off.
There were a couple of guys, 2 non-whites, and there's Mary Berry. She's not a youngster. There was something different about it that spoke to, let's recognise cultural change.
Okay, so it's representing cultural change, but it's also merchandising it.
Correct.
What are we saying? What is it, 4 million or 4 billion? I lose track of the noughts, because you've been talking about first, second wave, third wave, we're on to fourth wave feminism, and with each rolling of the tide, at first it was just white middle class women. Gradually, more and more women are being kind of incorporated into feminism, but at the same time, we have this kind of backlash, the cult of domesticity, that is incorporating
I
ethnicity,
agree, but Rachel,
class.
there's one point that I really think that second wavers, of which obviously I am, we didn't want to put down the whole notion of the personal, the familial, the friendship, the home, the raising of children. We actually wanted to say, no, those are interesting topics. We were brought up to think they were really uninteresting topics if we went to university. And the women talked about that and the men talked about real stuff. And then we worked out, no, this is real stuff. This is just as real as everything else that's been talked about. So, yes, I agree with you, but I also don't, because I think there's something about the domestic that is very, very important and needs not to be downgraded.
I mean, it's absolutely right. There are kind of dualities left, right and centre with all this stuff, aren't there? Obviously, and Helen, this seems like a good point to ask you about it, because obviously we have this kind of strange mix, don't we, where we do have such a big kind of industry has sprung up, but the popularity of craft, and you're a crafter, but then it's in some ways, the whole point of it is to make something yourself, for it to be homemade, but it's more expensive to knit a jumper than to buy a jumper. I mean, how do you wrestle with all this?
I think it was easy for me because it was just something I was raised doing by parents who made a lot of their own stuff, partly out of necessity because they didn't have a lot of money. Like, they used to mend all their own things. I was like, how do my parents know how to mend roofs and cut down trees? That's amazing. I still don't know how to do those things. I remember a few years ago when the trend was starting for a lot of workshops and a lot of hen dos that were going to make bunting, and there was some craft supplement with one of the weekend papers, and it was saying, hey, knit in public on the tube or something so everyone can see. And I was like, no, that is not what it's about. It's solitary, it's for your own self-improvement. This was before really the visual element of social media had really caught on. I suppose a lot of the commodification of it, it's a gateway for some people. I think a lot of people look at stuff and they think, I don't know how to do that. And unlike me, they don't think, let's try it. They think I'm not allowed. So it's in a way permission for them. And I think a lot of people, they might buy a knitting kit and then get very frustrated when it's slow and they don't do it perfectly first off and they give up. But the ones who persevere, that's just their starting point. So I think that's quite a positive thing if it gets people to discover that thing in themselves.
And where are the lines for you? Because it's a really funny one. I was thinking about this in the run-up to this, because my mum she was a seamstress, and she used to make clothes, and she used to do it for money because she didn't have any money. So when she was a student, she did that. And then she hated doing anything like that as she got older. And for her, it kind of harkened back. I remember asking her when I was in a band to make me some clothes for the stage because I was so tall I couldn't get these ridiculous kind of gold trousers that I wanted or whatever it was. And so she made me these, but I remember her really not enjoying it because it just reminded her of kind of, being poor. It's complicated for people, I think. Where are the lines for you, Helen, in, what kind of counts as craft and what counts as commerce? Because we have this kind of, this authenticity industry all around us.
It's so interesting what you're saying, because I would put into the question to Helen, relating to your mum, and when is it drudgery?
Yes.
Because when those frozen foods came in initially, that was really helpful for women. That is a form of relief or liberation. So I'm interested in the drudgery, craft, commerce argument.
That is one of the really big paradoxes because nowadays the middle class, we are seeking this authenticity all the time, and we're doing it a lot in food. I mean, so many things goes on in food. Like now we can go to fancy restaurants and eat, the pigtail and the feet and everything. And my grandmother was so happy she didn't have to eat it anymore, because it showed that they were not poor anymore.
Yeah.
And I think and I'm old enough to have been with my grandmother. There's actually some recipes in my book which takes 2 days to make, and I can remember having it once, because then my grandmother found out she could buy it in the new supermarket that just opened, and she was so happy she didn't have to do it again. So I think that is the paradox, because the craftsmanship and the cooking and all of that for the middle class now, that is for us a way to kind of connect with a lot of things that we have lost. And how do we tackle all of that, without being pressure,
Well, I think if you're lucky enough to have a craft or adore cooking or anything in the domestic, then it's really delicious. But if you don't, it's a lot of difficulty.
Yeah. Helen, what do you think?
Well, at the moment, I'm wearing a dress that I made, and I don't think that makes it or me better. It's just I liked the fabric.
It is an awesome dress, though. Come on, be honest.
Morally, I'm better because of the dress.
Obviously.
No, it's just I like the fabric. It has a pattern on it. It's sort of a paint by numbers of some stags. And because I'm bigger and it's harder to find clothes, and I need to cover my body in garments. So it's really a practical thing. And when people say, oh, where's that dress from? Because they too like the pictures of stags. And I say, oh, I made it. I'm not going, yeah, I made it. It's just the answer to where I got it from. But I feel like it comes across that way, that there's some kind of superiority that actually I don't feel. And then there's that thing as well, when you're young, it can be quite mortifying to wear homemade garments.
Yes.
Like, there's a tipping point of your
Yes,
age where it's not nice to wear a jumper that your nan knitted you anymore. It's like, oh, embarrassing.
Christmas jumper is mortifying until it's the most thoughtful gift that when
does it come back in? What's the age bracket
Well,
where
this is
homemade
it.
is
It's
the
when
worst?
you've got over needing to be exactly like everybody else in order to feel it's safe enough to risk having your own identity. I mean, that is the problem of being an adolescent, isn't it? You've all got to look the same and be the same in order to differentiate at all.
Susie, thank goodness you're here. I think that's all we've got time for, guys. But one final question. I mean, hibernation season is upon us. I'm going to be onesying up with a box set. Would any of my guests like to
I
share?
think that's a bit old-fashioned box set. I'm sorry.
I'm using it as a metonym.
generic.
As a metonym for
Okay.
I am going to be downloading some series of some shows. How will my guests be spending winter at home? Would anybody like to share? Trina.
I'm going to have a lot of hot chocolates and cinnamon buns.
That sounds all right. Helen Saltzman.
There's a patchwork quilt I started a year ago and I'm only 40% into, and it was commissioned by a friend, so I need to get on with it.
What about you, Rachel?
I will be engaging in making craft with my 3-year-olds, which will mainly involve a lot of glue, not on the paper, but on me and the table.
Perfect, standard. And Susie.
I hope to be putting my books away and I'll be playing with my grandson.
That sounds marvellous. Thank you very much indeed to my guests tonight, Helen Saltzman, Rachel Hurdley, Susie Orbach and Trina Harneman. Thank you all.
Okay, so a fascinating look at a bunch of things, just like the Love Island one, I suppose. A really in-depth look at some things that maybe we take for granted. I've never heard the Bake Off analysed quite so much, and also a great potted history of home and domesticity across the years. Sort of a bit of a history lesson as well as a sociological one. But of course, to us, it's the content itself is, I guess, secondary. What I want you to do is think about the show, its format, the kind of guests they have on, people like the hosts, Lauren Laverne and Emma Barnett, and think about how this show offers its target audience a number of different appeals. Use the box at the top right, as well as uses and gratifications in the green box at the bottom right, and any other appeals that you can think of. This is a really good opportunity to get as many as you can. Just to give as much evidence as possible. Okay, so that concludes the lesson on audiences. However, we will be picking up audience responses in a lot more detail in the final lesson on application of theory. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.